The silence was a physical blow, sharper than the woman's gasp that had preceded it. In the glittering expanse of the penthouse, under a constellation of crystal chandeliers, the deep red of the Bordeaux bled into the pristine silk of the gown, a violent stain on a canvas of wealth. Ava stood frozen, the broken stem of the wineglass a cruel shard in her trembling hand. The air, once filled with the murmur of polite conversation and the soft strains of a string quartet, was now a vacuum of judgment. The hostess, a woman sculpted from ice and privilege, aimed a look of pure venom at her. "On your knees," she hissed, her voice low but carrying across the cavernous room. "You will clean that with the hem of your uniform. Now." Every eye was on Ava, a spectacle of shame for their evening's amusement. But the real story was not the spill. It was the silent witness in the shadows, a man for whom this room was a chessboard and its people mere pawns. What he did next would shatter this fragile world, and if you watch until the end, you will understand how a single moment of defiance can ignite a war. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments what you believe true power looks like. This is a night that redefines everything. Ava, at 22, was a ghost who served gods. By day, she wrestled with charcoal and canvas, trying to capture the raw, messy truth of life. By night, she wore a starched black uniform and balanced trays of champagne, her face a carefully constructed mask of polite neutrality. She was an art student drowning in debt, haunted by the memory of a mother who taught her that dignity was the one thing no one could take from you. It was a lesson she clung to desperately in a city that measured worth in dollars and connections, two things she had never possessed. Her life was a quiet, relentless struggle, a silent war waged in the margins of a world that refused to see her. The penthouse was less a home and more a monument to untouchable power. It smelled of expensive perfume, rare orchids, and a sterile coldness that seeped into the bones. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the electric tapestry of the New York City skyline. But to Ava, they were just another set of bars on a gilded cage. She moved through the clusters of guests, their laughter like the clinking of ice in empty glasses, their conversations a foreign language of mergers, acquisitions, and casual cruelties. She felt the oppressive weight of their indifference, a constant reminder of her place. She was a function, not a person, a pair of hands to fill a glass or clear a plate, utterly invisible until she made a mistake. A deep-seated weariness lived within her, a sorrow that had settled in her heart long ago, after the accident that took her parents and left her utterly alone. That loss had forged in her a fierce, unyielding moral compass. She saw the injustice of the world with painful clarity, the casual arrogance of the powerful and the quiet suffering of those they stepped on. It was this sense of justice that kept her from shattering under the hostess's command. In her mind, she was not just a clumsy waitress. She was a witness to a casual act of tyranny, and her silence felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in. The shame burning on her cheeks was mixed with a defiant, simmering rage. The atmosphere in the room began to shift, the voyeuristic thrill of the guests curdling into something else. The silence stretched, becoming heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that had nothing to do with a spilled drink. It was as if the air itself had grown cold, the ambient light dimming around a single point of absolute stillness in the far corner of the room. The music from the string quartet faltered, a single discordant note hanging in the air like a question. The hostess, sensing the change, hesitated for the first time, her cruel smile wavering as a palpable sense of unease rippled through her audience. Someone was watching, and their attention was not a source of amusement. Ava felt it before she saw it, a gaze that cut through the suffocating weight of 100 others. It was not a look of pity or contempt. It was something far more unnerving, a gaze of intense, predatory focus emanating from the shadows near the grand piano. She couldn't make out a face, only the silhouette of a man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. His presence an immutable force of gravity in a room suddenly thrown off its axis. He had not moved, had not spoken, yet his silent observation held more power than the collective wealth and influence of everyone present. And in that moment, Ava knew her humiliation was no longer the main event. A far more dangerous game had just begun. Her world shrank to the dimensions of a city bus after midnight, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and exhaust fumes. Each jolt of the vehicle was a reminder of the miles separating the glittering towers she served from the worn-down Brooklyn neighborhood she called home. Ava leaned her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass, watching the city's lights smear into abstract streaks of gold and neon. The uniform, a crisp black and white shell, felt stiff against her skin, a costume she couldn't wait to shed. It was a constant physical reminder of her role, a silent cog in a machine of excess, her own dreams deferred with every glass of champagne she poured.
This was the rhythm of her life, a pendulum swing between two alien worlds, neither of which felt like her own. Her apartment was a testament to a life lived in the margins. It was a single room where the smell of turpentine from her art supplies fought a losing battle with the scent of instant noodles. Canvases, her true confidants, leaned against every wall, their half-finished faces and raw emotional landscapes telling a story of a world she yearned to create rather than just observe. Unpaid bills formed a precarious stack on the corner of a wobbly desk, a paper dragon she had to slay every month. The constant financial pressure was a low, humming anxiety that settled deep in her bones, a weight that made even the simple act of breathing feel like a luxury she was struggling to afford. This tiny space was both her sanctuary and her cell. It was only in front of a blank canvas that Ava felt truly alive, truly herself. Her hands, which were steady and anonymous while balancing trays, became expressive and certain when holding a charcoal stick or a paintbrush. She wasn't painting the pristine, sterile beauty of the world she served. She was capturing its cracks. She painted the tired eyes of the dishwasher in the kitchen, the weary slump of a man on the subway, the defiant weed growing through a crack in the pavement. Her art was her rebellion, a silent scream against the polished veneer of the city. It was where she processed the injustices she witnessed, translating her quiet rage and profound empathy into strokes of color and shadow, creating a truth that felt more real than anything else in her life. The catering company she worked for, Gilded Events, was a misnomer. There was nothing gilded about the steamy, cramped kitchens or the grueling 12-hour shifts. Her direct supervisor, a man named Henderson with a perpetually sour expression and eyes that lingered too long, seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from his small kingdom of authority. He policed their breaks down to the second, inspected their uniforms for imaginary flaws, and spoke to his staff with a thinly veiled contempt that poisoned the air. He represented a specific kind of mundane cruelty, the kind wielded by small men who resent anyone with a spark of life they themselves have lost. For Ava, he was a daily reminder of the powerlessness that came with her position. One evening, after a particularly exhausting shift, Henderson cornered her as she was clocking out. He held up a single chipped saucer, a casualty of a bustling kitchen. "This is coming out of your pay, Ava," he said, his voice dripping with condescending satisfaction. "Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time paying attention, you wouldn't be so careless." It wasn't about the money, which was negligible. It was about the humiliation, the deliberate act of diminishing her in front of the other tired workers. She met his gaze, her own steady and clear, and simply nodded. Arguing was a luxury she couldn't afford. It would only mark her as a problem, and she needed this job too much to become a problem. The money from her shifts rarely touched her own hands for long. A significant portion was wired each month to a quiet nursing facility upstate where her grandmother lived in a state of gentle, memoryless decline. It was a promise Ava had made to her mother before she died, to care for the last remaining piece of their family. This responsibility was both an anchor and a chain. It gave her purpose, a reason to endure Henderson's sneers and the aching in her feet. But it also tethered her to this life, pulling her further away from the art school education she was barely clinging to and the future she dreamed of. The weight of this love was immense, a silent, crushing force she carried alone. The uniform itself was a form of oppression. The stark white shirt, the tight black vest, the sensible, ugly shoes. It was a costume designed to erase individuality, to render the wearer an interchangeable part of the decor. Each night, as she buttoned the shirt, she felt a piece of herself recede. She became the waitress, a function, a pair of hands. Her thoughts, her art, her grief, all of it was packed away beneath the starched cotton. The uniform was a constant physical boundary between her and the world she served, a clear demarcation of class and status that was understood without a single word ever being spoken. It was the armor she wore into a battle she could never win. Yet, even in this suffocating environment, her core of empathy remained intact. She saw the fear in the eyes of a new busboy and offered him a quiet word of encouragement. She noticed when the elderly coat-check woman was shivering and forgot her own scarf near her station at the end of the night. These were small, almost invisible acts of defiance against the cold indifference of her world. They were her way of holding on to her own humanity, of insisting that dignity was not something that could be assigned or taken away based on one's station. It was an internal fire that no amount of condescension or exhaustion had managed to extinguish. It was the one thing that was truly hers. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was for a private reception at the Thorn Tower penthouse, a name that was synonymous with untouchable wealth and power. The bonus for working the event was substantial, enough to cover her grandmother's care for 2 months and buy the expensive oil paints she'd been staring at in a shop window for weeks. Henderson delivered the assignment with a warning. "This is the major leagues, Ava. One mistake and you're not just fired, you're blacklisted." A knot of dread tightened in her stomach, a premonition that this night would be different. But she had no choice. The money was a lifeline, and she had to take it, regardless of the risk. Before leaving her apartment that evening, she stood before the large, dark window that served as her only mirror. Her reflection, clad in the stark black and white uniform, seemed to float against the backdrop of the city's distant, glittering skyline. She saw a ghost of herself, a young woman about to willingly walk into the heart of a world that was designed to chew her up and spit her out. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air tasting of turpentine and anxiety. She straightened her back, adjusting the collar of her shirt. It was time to go. She was just another server, heading to just another party. But a cold certainty settled over her. Tonight, the invisible girl would finally be seen. His voice was not loud, but it fractured the silence with the finality of breaking glass. Enough. The word was a blade, sharp and cold, cutting through the thick, judgmental atmosphere of the penthouse. It originated from the far corner of the room, a pocket of shadow that had gone unnoticed until this moment. Every head turned, every pair of eyes swiveling toward the source of that quiet, absolute command. The hostess's cruel smirk faltered, her face draining of color as if the word had physically struck her. The air, once charged with her petty tyranny, now crackled with a far more potent and ancient form of fear. For the first time all night, Ava felt the collective gaze of the room lift from her, drawn away by a gravity she could not yet comprehend. It was a reprieve that felt more dangerous than the initial assault. From the darkness, Damien Thorne rose. He did not move quickly. There was no urgency in his motion, only an unnerving, deliberate grace. He was a man sculpted from shadow and steel, his form encased in a black suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed a part of him. His presence consumed the light, his shoulders broad, his posture radiating an immutable authority that made the opulent room feel small and fragile. He was not merely a guest. He was the center of this universe, and everyone else was simply a satellite caught in his orbit. The respectful silence that fell was not polite. It was primal, the hush of a forest when a predator passes through, a quiet born of pure instinctual reverence and terror. He began to walk toward her, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the marble floor. A path cleared before him, guests shrinking back, their expressions a mixture of awe and panic. They were the titans of their world, CEOs, politicians, financiers, yet in his presence they were reduced to schoolchildren before a wrathful headmaster. Ava watched his approach, her heart hammering against her ribs not with relief, but with a new, more profound dread. He was moving to her, for her, and this attention felt like being illuminated by a searchlight in the dead of night. She was no longer invisible. She was a target, singled out by the most powerful man in the room for reasons she could not begin to fathom. As he closed the distance, she could finally see his face. It was a study in harsh, elegant lines. A strong jaw, a straight nose, and eyes that held the cold, deep stillness of a winter lake. There were no laugh lines around them, only the faint silvery trace of a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a subtle testament to a life of violence hidden beneath the veneer of immense wealth and control. He was handsome in a way that was unsettling, his beauty devoid of warmth, a perfect, chilling mask that betrayed nothing of the man behind it. He stopped directly in front of her, his shadow falling over her. And for a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his judgment. His gaze, however, did not linger on the wine stain that had caused her ruin, nor did it register the broken glass still clutched in her hand. Instead, his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, locked directly onto hers. It was an invasive, dissecting look that bypassed her fear and her shame, seeming to search for something deeper within her soul. Ava felt stripped bare, as though he could see every hardship she had endured, every small compromise she had made, and every fierce, unbroken piece of her that remained. In his eyes, she saw no pity. She saw something far more terrifying, a flicker of recognition, a glint of something that felt like a shared wound, a darkness that recognized its own reflection. For Damien, the world had long been a predictable landscape of greed, ambition, and weakness. He navigated it with a cold, detached mastery, viewing people as assets or liabilities, pieces on a board he controlled with absolute precision. But this girl, kneeling on the floor yet refusing to break, was an anomaly. Her eyes held no tears, no plea for mercy. They held a quiet, defiant fire, a raw integrity that felt like a forgotten language from a life he had left behind long ago.
It was the same honor he fought to preserve within his own brutal code, a flicker of light in a world consumed by shadows. In that instant, she was not a clumsy waitress, she was a mirror, and the image it reflected both condemned and captivated him. He slowly turned his head, his gaze shifting from Ava to the hostess, who now stood frozen, her face a mask of pale, dawning horror. The cold assessment in his eyes sharpened into something lethal. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. He did not raise his voice, yet when he spoke, The words carried the weight of a death sentence, each syllable a perfectly polished stone of menace. "You derive pleasure from humiliating those you believe are beneath you," he stated, not as a question, but as a final, damning verdict. "It is a flaw I find distasteful." The quiet finality in his tone promised consequences far more severe than a ruined party or a stained reputation. Then, without breaking his stare from the terrified woman, he made his declaration. The words were quiet, spoken into the suffocating silence, yet they echoed like a cannon shot through the opulent space, shattering the foundations of everyone's world, especially Ava's. "From this moment on," Damien Thorne said, his voice a low, possessive growl that sent a shiver down her spine, "she belongs to me." It was not a rescue, it was a claim, an act of acquisition spoken with the same chilling certainty a king might use to claim a new territory. He had not saved her from one cage, he had simply moved her into a much larger, more gilded, and infinitely more dangerous one. Two men, previously invisible against the walls, materialized at his sides. They were as silent and imposing as their master, their presence a clear signal that the evening's entertainment was over. Damien gave a final, unreadable glance at Ava, a look that sealed the terrifying, unspoken contract he had just forged. It held a warning, a promise, and a question all at once, before he turned and walked away with the same unhurried, predatory grace with which he had arrived. He moved through the petrified crowd, a dark ship parting a frozen sea, and disappeared into the private elevator without a backward glance, leaving a wake of absolute silence and fear behind him. Ava remained on the floor, the world tilting on its axis. The hostess was a statue of broken pride. The guests were ghosts, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. But all she could feel was the echo of his presence. The lingering intensity of his gaze burned into her memory. The air still tasted of his power, a cold, metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. He was gone, but he had left an indelible mark on the room, and on her. She was no longer just Ava, the art student, the waitress. She was now a possession of Damien Thorne, a name whispered in shadows, and she understood with a chilling certainty that her life, the one she had fought so hard to control, was no longer her own. Life after that night was a series of jarring dissonances. Ava was escorted from the penthouse not by security, but by a silent man in a tailored suit who led her to a gleaming black sedan idling at the curb. The interior smelled of rich leather and cold, sterile power, a stark contrast to the lingering scent of shame on her skin. As the car moved silently through the city's glittering veins, she felt suspended between two realities. The one she knew, with its grit and struggle, and this new, terrifying one, where a man could claim a person like an object. The phrase, "she belongs to me," echoed in the silent, opulent space, not as a promise of safety, but as the sound of a gilded cage door swinging shut. She stared at her own wide-eyed reflection in the tinted window, a ghost being ferried into an unknown darkness. She spent the next day in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She expected a call, a summons, a sign that her life was no longer her own. But there was only a profound, unnerving silence. She forced herself to go to her art class, the familiar weight of her portfolio a flimsy anchor in a world that had come unmoored. The smell of charcoal and turpentine was supposed to be a comfort, but it couldn't ground her. Every shadow in the room seemed to hold his shape. Every quiet moment was filled with the memory of his voice. She tried to sketch,
but her hands were unsteady, her focus shattered. The face that emerged on the page was not her subject's, it was his, all sharp angles and cold, assessing eyes. The first encounter happened 3 days later. She was in a small independent bookstore in the village, a quiet haven where she often sought refuge from the city's noise. The air smelled of aging paper and brewed coffee. As she ran her fingers over the spine of a worn poetry book, a presence shifted the atmosphere. She looked up and saw him in a secluded armchair, partially hidden by a bookshelf. Damien Thorne was not looking at a book, he was looking at her. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet, unnerving certainty. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that was both a greeting and a claim. The cozy bookstore suddenly felt like a stage, and she was the only one under the spotlight. A war raged within her. Every instinct screamed for her to turn and run, to disappear back into the anonymity he had so violently stripped away.
He was a creature of the world she despised, a world of ruthless power, of men who moved people like pawns on a chessboard. Yet she could not erase the memory of his voice slicing through her humiliation. It wasn't kindness that had moved him. It was something colder, more proprietary. He hadn't saved her because she was helpless. He had intervened because his sense of order had been offended. This complex, dangerous contradiction drew her in even as it repelled her. A moth fascinated by a flame it knows will consume it. His influence began to seep into her life through invisible channels. She received a curt, formal letter of termination from Gilded Events. But the very next day, a courier delivered a cashier's check to her apartment for an amount that made her gasp, enough to cover her tuition and her grandmother's expenses for a year, with no sender listed. A week later, she heard through the grapevine that her former supervisor, Henderson, had vanished from his position, and the company was undergoing a sudden, hostile restructuring. Ava felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She had been avenged without her consent. He was tidying up the loose ends of her life, exerting a control that was as terrifying as it was absolute. From the tinted window of his car parked across the street, Damien watched her leave her apartment building, a heavy canvas portfolio clutched in her hand. He noted the defiant set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine. She walked through the world as if braced for a fight, yet her eyes, when she glanced around, held a deep, unguarded empathy for the city's forgotten souls. He had spent his life surrounded by people who were either predators or prey. She was neither. She was something else entirely, a flicker of stubborn, unyielding light. This fascination with her was a strategic flaw, a vulnerability he couldn't afford. Yet he found himself unable to sever the connection. Observing her became a quiet, dangerous obsession. He found her again sketching on a bench overlooking the East River. This time he did not remain in the shadows. He approached, his silent footsteps a stark contrast to the city's hum. He stood beside her for a long moment, his presence a palpable weight, before he spoke. His voice was low, devoid of its earlier menace. "What do you see?" he asked. His gaze not on her, but on the canvas where she had captured the weary, stoic face of a bridge worker on his lunch break. The question was simple, yet it pierced through her defenses. No one had ever asked her that, not with the intense, genuine curiosity that radiated from him. He wasn't asking about her technique, he was asking about her soul. Her reply was hesitant at first, her voice barely a whisper. She explained the story she saw in the man's face, the years of hard labor etched into the lines around his eyes, the quiet dignity in the set of his shoulders, the resilience of a life lived without applause. Damien listened with an unnerving, absolute stillness, his gray eyes fixed on her drawing.
As she spoke, her passion for her art momentarily eclipsed her fear of him. For a few minutes, the immense, terrifying chasm between their worlds seemed to shrink. They were not a mafia boss and a waitress. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a moment of quiet contemplation over a piece of charcoal on paper. As a sudden gust of wind swept across the promenade, it lifted a loose sheet of sketching paper from her lap. It fluttered away, and they both moved for it at the same time. Her hand, smudged with charcoal, reached it just as his did. Their fingers brushed, a brief electric contact. His skin was cool, his touch firm, sending a shock of unexpected warmth through her entire body. It was an accident, a fleeting, insignificant moment, but it shattered the fragile truce between them. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, something intensely personal and profoundly dangerous. They both froze, their hands still hovering in the air between them, the captured paper forgotten. The contact was a breach in Damien's fortress of control. For a man accustomed to violence and betrayal, the simple, uncalculated touch of her hand was more disorienting than a physical blow. It was a reminder of a humanity he kept ruthlessly suppressed, a connection to a world of softness and vulnerability he had long ago abandoned for his own survival. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his expression instantly shuddering, the cold mask of Damien Thorne sliding perfectly back into place. He had allowed himself a moment of weakness, a flicker of something he couldn't name, and the realization angered him. He was losing his grip, and she was the cause. In an act of desperate defiance, Ava found the address for his corporate headquarters and mailed back the check. With it, she included a short, terse note written on a torn piece of sketchbook paper. "I am not for sale." It was a foolish, reckless gesture, a mouse roaring at a lion. She knew it. The days that followed were filled with a gnawing anxiety. She braced herself for the consequences, for his anger, for the possibility that she had just thrown away the one shield protecting her. But instead of punishment, she was met with another calculated move that demonstrated the futility of her resistance. He was playing a different game, one whose rules she was only beginning to understand. 2 days later, the funds reappeared in her bank account, the amount now doubled.
This time, the transaction was not anonymous. The depositor was listed in stark corporate letters, Thorne Industries. The message was unequivocal and chilling. This was not charity. It was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. Her defiance was irrelevant. He would protect her, provide for her, whether she wanted him to or not. He was not giving her a choice in the matter. The act stripped her of her agency, making her feel more like a possession than ever before. Her small rebellion had only served to tighten the silken ropes of his control around her. His influence became a golden tide, lifting her life in ways that felt both miraculous and suffocating. The prestigious art gallery that had rejected her portfolio 3 times suddenly called, offering her a spot in their coveted Emerging Artists Showcase. The dean of her college, a man who barely knew her name, summoned her to his office to inform her that a new anonymous scholarship had been created, and she was its sole recipient, covering all her future expenses. Every door that had been closed to her was now swinging wide open. But she knew who held the master key. Each success felt tainted, a gift from a devil she hadn't made a bargain with, pulling her deeper into a debt she could never hope to repay. Fueled by a mixture of rage and desperation, she decided to confront him. She took a taxi to Thorne Tower, a monolithic spear of black glass that pierced the Manhattan sky. She expected to be stopped, to be turned away by layers of security.
But the guards simply nodded as she approached. The receptionist smiled, and an elevator was silently waiting to take her to the penthouse floor, as if her arrival had been anticipated all along. The seamless journey only amplified her sense of powerlessness. She stepped out into a vast, silent office that felt more like a modern art museum than a place of business. And there he was, standing before a floor-to-ceiling window, looking down on the city as if he owned it. "Stop it," she said, her voice shaking but clear in the cavernous silence. "Stop pulling the strings of my life. I don't want your money. I don't want your help. I am not a project. I am not one of your companies to acquire." Her words, which had felt so powerful in her head, seemed to be swallowed by the immense space, by the sheer, overwhelming force of his stillness. He let her speak, his gray eyes never leaving her face, his silence a far more effective weapon than any argument. He waited until her defiant breath ran out, letting the weight of her own outburst settle around her. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them until only a few feet of charged air remained. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously soft. "You believe the world is a fair place, Ava? That your talent and your integrity are enough? This city," he said, gesturing to the sprawling metropolis behind him, "is a machine that feeds on people like you. It chews them up and spits them out. I am not controlling your life. I am simply balancing the scales." He took another step, his shadow falling over her. The game was always rigged. The only thing that has changed is that now it is rigged in your favor. Just as she was about to retort, to reject his dark, cynical logic, his phone, lying on a vast marble desk, lit up with a notification. Her eyes were drawn to the screen. It was a photograph, crisp and clear, of her grandmother sitting on a bench in the nursing home's garden, smiling at a bird. The timestamp in the corner read 2 minutes ago. It wasn't overtly menacing, yet it was the most profound threat she had ever received. It was a quiet, absolute demonstration of his reach, a reminder that his world had no boundaries. He saw the flicker of terror in her eyes. "Some cages, Ava," he said, his voice a low, intimate whisper that slid under her skin. The art gallery was a universe of pristine white walls and polite murmuring voices, a world Ava had only ever dreamed of entering on her own terms. Tonight she was its reluctant star. Her charcoal portraits, raw and unflinching, hung under the soft glow of track lighting, drawing quiet, appreciative crowds. It should have been a triumph, the culmination of years of silent, solitary work. Yet she felt like a fraud, a carefully curated exhibit in Damien Thorne's private collection. Each compliment she received felt like a coin dropped into his pocket, a reminder that this success was not truly hers. She moved through the room with a practiced smile, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, waiting for the illusion to shatter. This world of refined taste and intellectual praise felt more dangerous than any penthouse party. A man detached himself from the crowd, his smile too smooth, his suit too sharp. He was handsome in a way that set her teeth on edge, a polished predator gliding through a field of unsuspecting prey. He introduced himself as Julian Croft, an admirer of her work, but his eyes had no interest in the art on the walls. They were fixed on her, dissecting her with a cold, proprietary curiosity. "Damien has excellent taste," he murmured, his voice a low purr that was meant to be charming but felt like a violation.
He always did have an eye for acquiring rare and beautiful things. The words hung in the air between them, an implicit threat disguised as a compliment. Ava felt a chill that had nothing to do with the gallery's air conditioning. This was not an art lover. This was a soldier from Damien's world, and he had just crossed the border into hers. Julian leaned closer, his scent of expensive cologne and subtle menace invading her personal space. "He's a very busy man," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sometimes his investments are left unprotected. A girl with your talent, with a grandmother in a quiet little place upstate, it would be a shame if something were to disrupt such a delicate arrangement." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a blade pressed gently against her throat. Her blood ran cold. This was the true cost of Damien's protection. She was no longer just a person. She was leverage, a target, a weakness to be exploited by his enemies. The gallery, her sanctuary, had instantly transformed into a battlefield, and she was standing on the front line, completely unarmed. A lifetime of staying silent, of enduring, of making herself small to survive, came to a head in that single terrifying moment. The fear was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. But something else rose to meet it, a white-hot, defiant rage. This man would not use her family. He would not use her art. He would not use her. Ava met his gaze, her own eyes clear and cold as ice. "You are not welcome here," she said, her voice barely audible but ringing with an authority that stunned them both. "This is my space. Leave now." It was the most reckless, suicidal act of her life. She had not screamed for help or run to find security. She had drawn a line in the sand, challenging a monster with nothing but the sheer force of her own will. Just as Julian's smile curdled into something ugly, a profound silence fell over the gallery. It was as if the sound had been vacuumed from the room. Damien Thorne stood in the arched doorway, his presence a vortex of absolute stillness and power that bent the entire atmosphere around him. He hadn't made a sound, yet everyone felt his arrival like a drop in barometric pressure. His eyes, cold and gray as a storm-tossed sea, swept past the gawking patrons, past the terrified gallery owner, and landed on Julian. But then they moved to Ava, and in them she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before. Not anger, not possession, but a raw, unguarded fury that was terrifying in its intensity. He was not looking at a liability. He was looking at something of his that had been threatened. "Julian," Damien said, and his voice, though quiet, was the sound of a tomb door grinding shut. He began to walk toward them, his steps deliberate and soundless. The crowd parted before him like a receding tide. "You have overstayed your welcome." Julian's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He held his hands up in a placating gesture. "Just admiring the art, Damien. A friendly chat." Damien did not stop until he was standing directly in front of him, so close that his shadow completely eclipsed the other man. "My business," Damien whispered, the words laced with a lethal promise, "and you will never speak to her again." Before Julian could respond, Damien moved. It was not a punch or a shove. It was an act of precise, terrifying control. His hand shot out and clamped around Julian's wrist, his fingers digging into the bone with an audible crack. A choked gasp of pain escaped Julian's lips, his face contorting in agony. "She is not part of our world," Damien hissed, his voice a low, venomous current meant only for Julian, though Ava heard every word. "And if you ever forget that, I will erase you so completely that your own mother won't remember your name." He held the grip for a second longer, a silent, brutal demonstration of power, before flinging the man's arm away in disgust. He had just broken his most sacred rule. He had shown his hand, revealed his weakness, and committed an act of violence in her world, for her. Julian and his entourage scrambled out of the gallery like startled rats. A stunned, horrified silence remained. The patrons stood frozen, their wine glasses suspended in mid-air. Damien did not look at them. He turned to Ava, and for the first time his perfect mask of control was gone. His chest was rising and falling with ragged breaths, his eyes blazing with the residual violence of the confrontation. He saw the terror on her face, the way she was trembling, and something inside him seemed to break. He took a hesitant step toward her, his hand lifting, not in a gesture of ownership, but of desperate, uncertain connection. His fingers brushed her arm, a touch that was meant to steady her, but felt like a brand. That single point of contact was a cataclysm. Through it, a current of unspoken truths passed between them. She felt the violent, protective instinct that drove him, a force born not of cold strategy, but of a deep, primal wound. It was not a desire to own her, but a desperate, terrifying need to shield the one flicker of light he had allowed into his darkness. He, in turn, felt her fear, but beneath it he felt the unyielding steel of her spirit, the same fire he had seen in her eyes that first night. She had not cowered, she had stood her ground.
In that moment, he realized he wasn't protecting a fragile object. He was standing beside an equal, and that knowledge shook him to his very core. He pulled his hand back as if the contact had burned him. The air between them crackled with the aftershock. The noise of the gallery, the city, the entire world faded into a distant hum, leaving only the sound of their shared, unsteady breathing. He had shattered his own code, publicly declaring her importance and inviting chaos into his meticulously ordered life. She had stared into the face of his world and had not broken, forever binding herself to its violence. They stood in the ruins of her perfect night, no longer a monster and his possession, but a man and a woman who had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Everything had changed, and the silence that followed was the sound of their two worlds colliding and fusing into one. The ride back to her apartment was a study in suffocating silence. The aftermath of the gallery confrontation hung between them, thick and heavy as funeral velvet. Outside the tinted windows of the sedan, the city lights bled into streaks of neon and gold, as a cold rain began to fall, each drop a tiny percussion against the roof. Ava stared at her own reflection, a pale, wide-eyed ghost superimposed over the rushing landscape. She could still feel the phantom pressure of Damien's hand on her arm, a brand of violence and desperate protection. He sat beside her, a statue carved from shadow, his gaze fixed on the rain-slicked streets ahead. He had torn a hold in her world to save her, and now the cold void of his was rushing in, threatening to consume everything. The air in the car was thin, stolen by the magnitude of what had not been said. When the car slid to a silent stop in front of her building, the engine's hum was the only sound. Damien did not turn to her. He continued to stare out the windshield, his profile a hard, unforgiving line against the city glow. "This ends now," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the raw fury she had witnessed just an hour before. "My world is not a place for you. Forget you ever met me." It was not a request, it was a command, an act of surgical excision. He was cutting her out of his life to save her from the infection he carried. Before she could form a reply, his driver was already out of the car, holding an umbrella for her. She stepped out into the rain, and the black sedan pulled away from the curb without a backward glance, disappearing into the watery night like a phantom. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, felt like a tomb. The triumphant scent of her success at the gallery had been replaced by the metallic tang of fear and the damp chill of the storm outside. She stood in the middle of the room, dripping onto the worn wooden floor, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. His absence was a physical presence, a hollow space where his dangerous gravitational pull had been. She looked at her canvases, at the faces she had drawn, and they seemed naive, relics from a life of simpler sorrows. He had shown her a darkness she had only ever tried to capture with charcoal, and now its shadow is cast permanently across her own soul. The city's distant hum was a lonely sound, a reminder that she was once again an anonymous soul in a city of millions, but she was no longer the same. In his own sterile fortress high above the city, Damien stood before a wall of glass, the rain lashing against it in a futile assault. He poured a measure of amber liquid into a heavy crystal tumbler, the clink of the bottle the only sound in the cavernous penthouse. His knuckles were white where he gripped the glass. Julian Croft was a symptom of a larger problem. By showing his hand, by revealing a vulnerability, he had invited every shark in the water to circle. He had to be twice as ruthless now, twice as cold, to cauterize the wound she represented. He had spent a lifetime building walls to contain the monster within him, and in one night, for her, he had let it out of its cage. The feeling it had stirred in him, that raw, protective fury, was a poison he could not afford to taste again. Ava tried to reclaim her life, to force it back into its old familiar shape. She returned to her studio, to the comforting smell of turpentine and linseed oil. But the expensive, pristine canvases he had indirectly provided felt like accusations. She picked up a stick of charcoal, but her hand felt alien, her inspiration soured. His influence was an invisible ink staining every part of her existence. The freedom from financial worry, once a dream, now felt like a chain. She could no longer see the world in simple shades of light and shadow. He had introduced her to a spectrum of gray so profound that it tainted her vision, and her art, which had once been her escape, now served only as a mirror reflecting her own complicated captivity. The fallout from the gallery incident was a subtle, creeping poison. Whispers followed her through the halls of her college. The art community, which had briefly embraced her, now treated her with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. She was no longer Ava, the promising artist. She was the woman associated with Damien Thorne, a name that carried the weight of rumor and violence. Doors that had miraculously opened for her now held an invisible barrier.
In his own sterile fortress high above the city, Damien stood before a wall of glass, the rain lashing against it in a futile assault. He poured a measure of amber liquid into a heavy crystal tumbler, the clink of the bottle the only sound in the cavernous penthouse. His knuckles were white where he gripped the glass. Julian Croft was a symptom of a larger problem. By showing his hand, by revealing a vulnerability, he had invited every shark in the water to circle. He had to be twice as ruthless now, twice as cold, to cauterize the wound she represented. He had spent a lifetime building walls to contain the monster within him, and in one night, for her, he had let it out of its cage. The feeling it had stirred in him, that raw, protective fury, was a poison he could not afford to taste again. Ava tried to reclaim her life, to force it back into its old familiar shape. She returned to her studio, to the comforting smell of turpentine and linseed oil. But the expensive, pristine canvases he had indirectly provided felt like accusations. She picked up a stick of charcoal, but her hand felt alien, her inspiration soured. His influence was an invisible ink staining every part of her existence. The freedom from financial worry, once a dream, now felt like a chain. She could no longer see the world in simple shades of light and shadow. He had introduced her to a spectrum of gray so profound that it tainted her vision. And her art, which had once been her escape, now served only as a mirror reflecting her own complicated captivity. The fallout from the gallery incident was a subtle, creeping poison. Whispers followed her through the halls of her college. The art community, which had briefly embraced her, now treated her with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. She was no longer Ava, the promising artist. She was the woman associated with Damien Thorne, a name that carried the weight of rumor and violence. Doors that had miraculously opened for her now held an invisible barrier.
People were afraid to get too close, as if his darkness were a contagion she might carry. His attempt to protect her had ultimately isolated her, placing her in a different kind of cage, one made not of gilded bars, but of infamy and fear. She was more alone now than she had ever been before. To reassert his dominance, Damien became the cold, calculating predator his reputation promised. His days were a series of brutal negotiations and quiet, lethal commands delivered over encrypted phone lines. He dismantled Julian Croft's minor empire with surgical precision, not out of anger, but as a cold, dispassionate lesson to any who might mistake his interest in Ava for a weakness. Each strategic move, each act of calculated cruelty, was a stone he placed back onto the wall around his heart. He was burying the man who had touched her arm in the gallery, suffocating him under the weight of Damien Thorne, the myth. He worked relentlessly, driven by a need to widen the chasm between their worlds until it was utterly uncrossable. One evening, Ava found herself standing before her window, watching the rain fall just as it had the night he left. The initial ache of his absence had subsided, crystallizing into a painful, diamond-hard clarity. She finally understood the true nature of his final command. It wasn't a rejection, it was the only act of genuine protection he could offer. To keep her safe, he had to erase himself from her life completely. She saw him not as a monster, but as a man trapped in a self-made prison, a king ruling over a kingdom of ashes. Her fear of him softened into a profound, aching empathy for the man he was, and the man he could never allow himself to be. The pain of her loss became a quiet, knowing sorrow, a burden she now had the strength to carry. In a quiet act of defiance and acceptance, she gathered all the expensive, high-quality art supplies that had appeared in her life and carefully stored them away. She pulled out an old, scarred easel and a sheet of rough, cheap paper. Then she reached for her original tools, a handful of worn, smudged charcoal sticks, the kind she had used when her art was nothing more than a private rebellion against an indifferent world. It was a conscious choice to shed the gilded skin he had given her, to find her own voice again, untainted by his influence. She needed to know if she could still create beauty from struggle, if the artist she was before him still existed, or if he had changed her so irrevocably that she was now a stranger to herself. Weeks bled into a month, and the silence from him remained absolute, a vast, echoing emptiness in the city's noise. It became a constant companion for Ava, the ghost of a conversation that never happened, the weight of a connection too dangerous to exist. The city moved on, oblivious, but for her and for him, time seemed to have fractured on that rainy night. They lived in the same sprawling metropolis, two solitary figures separated by an impassable gulf of their own making. He in his tower of glass and shadow, and she in her small room of canvas and light, were both haunted by the same profound silence, the deafening echo of all the things they would never be allowed to say. A year passed, a quiet eternity, measured in charcoal dust and the changing light on the Brooklyn rooftops. Ava's first solo exhibition was not in a pristine, soulless gallery uptown, but in a small, raw space in the Lower East Side, with exposed brick walls and floors that creaked with history. The success was modest, but it was hers, earned through sleepless nights and a relentless refusal to surrender her vision. The air smelled of cheap wine, oil paint, and the electric buzz of genuine excitement. She stood amidst her work, a collection of portraits capturing the city's bruised and beautiful soul, and for the first time since that night, she felt whole. She had rebuilt her world, not by forgetting his, but by learning to draw the beauty in its cracks, finding her own light in the aftermath of his shadow. The heart of the exhibition was a single large canvas that drew every eye. It was not a portrait of a face, but of a feeling. Titled simply "The King in the Tower," it depicted a figure forged from jagged lines of black and midnight blue, a silhouette of immense power and crushing solitude, standing before a fractured window. The figure was a void, a shape of pure darkness, yet from the very center of its chest, a single defiant pinprick of warm golden light bled outwards, struggling against the overwhelming shadow. It was not a painting of a monster. It was a painting of a man at war with himself, an act of empathy so profound it felt like a prayer. It was her final, silent answer to the question he had asked her by the river. "What do you see?" He entered as a ghost, a ripple in the fabric of the crowded room that only the air seemed to notice. Damien Thorne stood in the shadows by the entrance, a figure of impossible stillness amidst the motion and chatter. Ava, her back to him as she spoke animatedly with an elderly professor, did not see him. He wore the same armor of a dark tailored suit, but something in his posture had changed. The rigid control was still there, but it was laced with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. His gaze swept past the other canvases, uninterested, until it found the king in the tower. He froze, and for a long, silent moment, the most powerful man in the city was held captive by a few words.
Dollars worth of paint and canvas. In the abstract chaos of her brushstrokes, he saw a truth no mirror had ever shown him. She had not captured his wealth or his reputation for violence. She had captured his cage. She had seen the suffocating weight of his crown, the isolation of his throne, and the small, flickering ember of a soul he had long thought extinguished. It was an absolution he had never sought and did not believe he deserved. To be seen so completely, with such terrifying and gentle clarity, was a more profound intimacy than any touch, a more devastating blow than any rival's attack. He felt the walls he had spent a lifetime building not crumble, but become transparent, leaving his scarred heart utterly exposed to her light. The next morning, the gallery owner called, her voice trembling with disbelief. An anonymous buyer, wiring funds through a Swiss intermediary, had purchased the king in the tower for a price that would change Ava's life forever. The message was clear, delivered without a single word. It was not payment, it was an acknowledgement. A final, silent transaction that settled a debt that was never about money. Ava stood by her window, looking out at the vast, indifferent city, and a single, slow tear traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of joy, but of a deep, quiet, and heartbreaking understanding. He had let her go, but he would never truly be gone. In the highest room of the Thorn Tower, the painting hung alone on a vast wall of black marble, illuminated by a single soft light. It was the only piece of art, the only glimpse of color in the sterile perfection of his world. Damien stood before it, the glass of whiskey in his hand forgotten. He looked at the pinprick of gold fighting its way out of the darkness, a silent testament to the woman who had seen him not for who he was, but for who he might have been. He lifted his free hand, his fingers hovering just millimeters from the canvas, not daring to touch the fragile light she had found within him. For in the end, some cages are not made of steel and stone, but of the choices we can never undo. If their story touched you, if you believe that even in the deepest shadows a flicker of light can survive, then let us know. Like this video, share it with someone who understands the weight of unspoken words, and comment below with the one thing you believe is worth fighting for. Subscribe for more stories that remind us that the most profound connections are often the ones we can never truly hold.